My name is Mike Silber. I'm the head of legal and commercial for Liquid Telecom. And our vision is slightly different from a lot of the other visions over here. What we've been seeing over the last 6 years is a glut of capacity arriving in Africa in coastal regions. We've started seeing coastal regions becoming incredibly well served. What we've realized is that inland regions are particularly poorly served, and anybody here who's involved in a commercial basis will know that it's more expensive to get your capacity from Cape Town to Johannesburg than it is to get it from Cape Town to London. There are a number of reasons for that, and chances are that market's going to be changing relatively rapidly over the next few years, but that's the current situation. Is for capacity in Johannesburg, international transit capacity, the terrestrial South African portion is more expensive than the submarine portion. When you start looking at landlocked countries like Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Zambia, the situation is even worse. And that's where we saw both a commercial opportunity as well as a social opportunity. So a little bit about us. We were founded in 2004. We were part of the Econet Group. We started off as a satellite and voice operator, and we continue in those spaces. If you may have seen also from the very beginnings or the initial slide, we also do payments, WiMAX, and wireless last mile. We have continued with those technologies, but we started planning fiber in 2008. We launched our high-speed fiber between Zimbabwe to South Africa and then through the undersea cables to the rest of the world in 2010. What I'd like to point out is that when we started planning, we also started applying for our wayleaves in South Africa at the same time. Our South African network may be lit in the next month, but we're having some problems again in terms of permissions and access to government properties, while our Zimbabwean network is pretty much complete. So 2010, the Zimbabwe network was launched. The South African network may get launched in May 2013. We launched our high-speed fiber between Zambia and Zimbabwe in 2011. Earlier this year, we acquired Kenya Data Networks and the related companies with networks and operations in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC. Services we provide include IP transit, national backhaul, international and national MPLS services, international high-speed Ethernet, legacy STMX, SDH connections. At the moment, we have more than 12,500 kilometers of fiber running live traffic. Now, that may sound rather insignificant compared to Telkom's traffic and Telkom's 140,000 kilometers of fiber. What I can tell you is this is either fiber strung on high voltage wires, it's not strung on gum poles on the side of the road, or buried fiber with service levels exceeding 98%. And as we're going through some of the teething problems and ironing out some of the installation issues we've had, we're starting to head towards 99 and above on most aspects of our network. What we don't do is build where there's already existing capacity. And the fact that we're building from Gauteng up to Beitbridge gives you an indication of the quality of service we've been getting from the existing operators with fiber in that area. And if that's any indication of the quality of the 144,000 kilometers of fiber, a lot of that's got to be reworked. We're also doing a fair amount of wireless access and transmission, and we're busy rolling out an FTTX network in Harare. There's some questions as to the viability of that, and I'm inclined to agree with Cole in terms of some of the comments he made about wireless last mile and access networks, but we're giving it a punt in Harare. We believe we've got the market presence to be able to do that. So our Central African fiber project, which we started off from the south, high capacity optic fiber network, state-of-the-art technology, 8,500 kilometers planned, about 7,500 kilometers complete, linking Zimbabwe, Zambia, DRC, Lesotho through into our POP in South Africa using mesh, ring and star topologies, looking at other options in terms of redundancy, mainly a construction project, and that's something that I found quite interesting from Carl's comments, is we're primarily looking at construction over here. Running networks is where it gets interesting, but actually building them is hard slog with civil engineers. It takes a while before the really interesting networking can start happening. And the key is to provide multiple redundant access to multiple international carriers. So if you're on the East Coast and the East Coast cables go down because, for example, both of the East Coast cables run in through pretty much the same entrance, it's about 50 meters of each other in Mombasa. If both of them go down, well, you've got redundancy coming through from the south or the west, and using terrestrial redundancy. If you happen to be having a tiff with your neighbor and you're worried about your neighbor cutting you off, well, you've got redundancy coming in north, south, east, or west, as the case may be. So this is what our network looked like in 2012. The darker pink is the built network, the lighter pink is planned or under construction. And with the acquisition of KDN, that's what our network looks like in 2013. As I said, what's happened? Submarine cables have been built. Competition has brought about a rapid crash in prices. Our view, subsea capacity, and Tylen and I can debate this if people are interested. Our view is that subsea capacity has probably now exceeded current demand. Future growth, obviously, we're not even close, but in terms of current demand, I think we're pretty much there. Terrestrial fiber networks are being built or rebuilt. Digging takes a lot longer than laying fiber on the seabed, not least because of the way leaves required. Crossing borders can take almost as long as negotiating international subsea consortia. And again, I can see Tylen smiling about that one. I don't know how many borders he's crossed, but I know that he's negotiated at least one and is in the middle of a second consortium. So I'm surprised that he has so much hair and that it's remained, most of it has remained the original color. But these are tough discussions. At the moment, there are multiple projects being run by ISOC, the Internet Society, and others, looking at cross-border connectivity. And border crossings has been one of the biggest issues in Africa, is actually convincing both sides of what the regulatory requirements are in order to allow a border crossing. We find sometimes the easiest way to do it is just make sure you have a license on both sides, because in the absence of a license on both sides, trying to convince authorities to let you cross is sometimes really difficult. And cross-border capacity is usually used for commercial IP transit from countries with landing stations to landlocked countries, as well as for voice and corporate data networks. What we view and our vision of what needs to happen, and maybe I'm giving away a few of the company's strategic directions in the next few years, but you'll see in terms of what we've been doing. Our view, investment in high-speed last mile will drive growth in subscribers. Up until now, the investment has been happening significantly on the submarine side, a lot of investment now on the terrestrial. There needs to be the continued increase in investment in the high-speed last mile. Part of the issue has been, and in particular in countries like South Africa, has been a slightly schizophrenic approach of people needing to build high-speed last mile access, but not necessarily having the high-speed backhaul to those base stations or to support those DSL or other technologies. You know, questions around LLU, questions around facilities leasing, access to last mile networks has been a huge obstacle around growth. And so people have had this rather confused approach. Do we build backhaul? Do we build last mile? Do we try and spread our investment and build both? Well, hopefully reasonably soon, the backhaul networks are going to be in place, then operators can focus on the last mile. You're looking at technologies like FTTH, FTTX if you prefer, WiMAX, LTE, flavors of DSL that Roy was referring to. Local loop unbundling would be nice. And I'm not referring South Africa in particular, and Richard, please, this is not a personal attack, though I know that you're going to touch on LLU slightly, but at least in South Africa we're having the discussion. We haven't advanced it very far, but at least we're having the discussion. Most of the countries we're working in, it hasn't even been put in the table. It hasn't entered into the regulations. It's not even contemplated in the legislation. So in those countries, LLU would be very nice, but you have to recognize that you're going to be playing a slightly schizophrenic role, because access to that last mile, access to that high-speed access network is not going to be available on a wholesale basis for many years, possibly for many decades to come. And so you've got to combine building a backhaul network with building an access network, and hence our rolling out a GPON network in Harare. Services based around high-speed content will also drive growth in bandwidth used by subscribers, the point that Carl was making. What we're seeing though, and what's going to be really interesting, is how much local content we can get. Because right now, the key driver is pushing your YouTube videos and pushing your US or European content into African smart devices. What's going to make a huge difference is when we start looking at African content, not just African caches, but real African content driving content and actual development of networks within Africa. One of the things that I do in the spare time that I have is looking at the domain name system. And one of the points that I keep trying to drive home to people, it's not just about selling content or apps or bits or bytes. The key is the more content you have running locally, the better your systems have to be locally. Not just your network, your last mile, but your backhaul. Not just your backhaul, but also your data centers. And you're seeing a general upscaling of all of the infrastructure across the telecommunications environment, and not just single points of failure that we're currently seeing, where you're looking at bumping up your base station from GSM to 3G or moving towards 4G, etc. We're going to see more investment in terrestrial trunk routes, national, backhaul, cross-border. As business cases increase, so those routes will increase. I don't think people are going to stop building those, but we're certainly going to see, as more are put in place, we're going to see some of the marginal business cases becoming more evolved. The GSM networks, in our view, not the internet, are the main drivers of investment in national backhaul. Right now, voice is still king in Africa. Data is getting there, but voice is still the killer app in Africa. 3G has the capability to deliver to millions of subscribers, not always at broadband speeds. As we move towards 4G and LTE, obviously that's going to improve. But right now, voice is still the killer app. And then increased internet subscribers times more bandwidth per subscriber makes the cost per megabit per second less expensive, and it'll drive subscriber growth. One of the things we're recognizing is that the drop in ARPU is inevitable. The only way to make up for a drop in ARPU is by increasing the number of subscribers and increasing their appetite for services across the board. There's a lot more that I can say about what we're experiencing in Africa, but the biggest issue that I can say is our experience. Countries that provide obstacles, as the private sector, we do one of two things. We either find a way around them, or we realize this is an obstacle that's just not worth trying to find a way around, and we just bypass them. It is possible right now for us, and we've restructured after our KDN acquisition, we've restructured our network, and we've restructured the network that we have a direct connection between South Africa and Kenya via the submarine cables. We don't need to go terrestrial. If somebody is an obstacle, and that obstacle is not something we can work around, as the private sector, we don't need to keep beating our heads against that rock. We can just walk around it. And that's what I would encourage everybody, because not everybody in this room is from South Africa, is the more open your policies, the more forward-thinking your policies, the more likely you are to encourage various of the people on this panel to come to your country and say, great, where can we start digging? Where can we start building? What can we do to encourage growth. And the one thing that we don't ask for, and we would encourage you never to insist on, is exclusivity or monopoly. Because the less exclusivity, the more open your networks, the more growth you're going to have. It's going to drop down prices, and it's going to raise up the number of subscribers. And hopefully then you find that balance where operators can be really profitable, but at the same time the services are accessible. Right now there's no point in offering Cinderella services at hundreds of dollars per subscriber when only a handful of subscribers in the country can actually make use of it. I think let me leave it over there.
Mike, with regards to, if I just can ask you one question, something you didn't really touch on, your opinion of private sector versus government. You feel that you want to be left alone, this is what we do, we've got shareholders, we have to, and government must go and take care of.
From my perspective, and maybe it's just our shareholders, the one thing that our shareholders can't tolerate is delay and uncertainty. Or the two things they can't tolerate is delay and uncertainty. If there's a timetable, and if there's some clarity that we know that at least for the next 5 or 10 years or whatever it is, this is the situation, we can build a business case, make sure the business case works, and proceed or decide not to proceed. In some countries, we've gone with joint ventures with the public sector. Zambia is an example. Our network rollout in Zambia is a 50-50 joint venture with a majority state-owned company. And it works incredibly well because of the way that we've structured it, and we've structured it, we think, in a very efficient, effective manner. We're open to considering a purely private play. Yes, it's nice to be left alone, but we realize in many countries that's not going to happen. So stop chasing after a dream. We'll find a way to work around it. And one of the ways is to work with the public sector. Whether it's a triple P, whether it's a build, operate, transfer, whether it's just a build and transfer, build, own, operate, there are dozens of models out there on ways to work with the public sector. There are dozens of models to make it real. What you need is somebody who's willing to come to the table, willing to have an open discussion, and once that discussion's been had and it's been locked down, it then is locked down for a good period of time. You have certainty for at least 5 to 10 years so that you can build your business case. Just an example, and I'm not sure how many people are aware of it, is the consortium model that the Kenyan government is building around their 4G LTE wireless network, where they invited responses. Everybody who responded has been invited to join a consortium. The state will contribute the 4G spectrum. The consortium will build a network, and it'll be an open access network. So anybody who has a license to provide services can then use that network to provide services to customers. Pricing will be based on proper competition principles. So the pricing may not be equal, but there will be a basis for differentiation. So somebody who's buying 10 gigs of capacity is obviously going to pay a lower price and would expect to pay a lower price than somebody who's buying 10 megs of capacity. But on that basis, the proposal is that instead of different parties now competing and contesting for access to 4G spectrum, rather let operators who have a focus on customer acquisition, are very good at marketing, selling devices, getting services out there, do that. Let operators whose interest is in building networks do that, and let them form a consortium where anybody who wants to buy wholesale, as long as they have an appropriate license, can get access onto that network. So infrastructure stops being the obstacle. Infrastructure stops being such a strategic issue where we're all holding on as we do in South Africa. Everybody builds their infrastructure and tries desperately to hold on to it and not allow anybody else to access it. But it actually becomes a true open access network where the only way the network is going to be profitable is if everybody makes use of it. You don't want anybody to want to build their own. It must be so attractive to every operator that there's no point in building your own. And that's something that British Telecom has done very effectively with their fibre network, is until recently, with Virgin and a few others, there was no incentive for operators to build their own fibre networks in the UK because BT made it so attractive to use their network.
One of the critical issues that we have in South Africa is the inability of the property management companies to stay out of telecoms. Whenever, and I'm almost weekly in meetings now, where where telecommunications companies are saying, but when we try and go to this building, the property management company says, but you must pay me. So what's in it for me? So we can't drive down the cost of telecommunications infrastructure unless we address that issue as well. Mike, is that something you guys come across in Africa in general? Is it a...
You know, at the moment, I think possibly because many of the countries in which we operate have been starved of true broadband connectivity. Property owners see that as a strategic competitive advantage for them, that if they can offer their customers a true broadband experience, then that will actually make their property more attractive. So they're actually saying, come in, put in facilities. They're not looking to charge us. I suspect as we're starting to see more competition, that'll change. What we're seeing is a few people who've either done a lot of research or maybe are part of an international group who are saying, well, you know, we'd like to see a meet me room so that we can actually bring in third parties. You're the first party to approach us. Chances are you're going to be more or less exclusive here for a couple of years. But in due course, we'd like a meet me room so that our tenants have some choice, that our tenants have the ability to actually look at multiple opportunities and are not locked into a single provider. Or they're saying, fine, put down the fiber on our park, but after 5 years, we take ownership of it. And in most cases, again, it's a commercial arm wrestle. But if we want to get to that property, and if the terms are reasonable, we'll get there. And if they're not reasonable, well, then we'll connect next door.
There is, of course, a danger that we're looking into a single entity managing fiber. And we've actually experienced that with one of our customers in Kenya, where poor quality of service is a stumbling block for that specific operator. And also the strategy and implementation from government side is too slow for them. And they decided to go it alone because of that. Poor quality, single point of contact is a potential stumbling block.
Absolutely. And given that the operator that we acquired, people will know, has had quality issues over time, I think I know exactly who you're talking about. And yes, sooner or later it will lead to market failure. What you don't necessarily want to do from a policy perspective is create an environment where change will only occur through market failure. You know, market failure is a very powerful way of implementing change, but it's quite lengthy and it's very painful, including people losing jobs, and governments don't ever want people to lose jobs. Not just state-owned companies, but any company where you're seeing job losses is a negative impact for government. So it's a very difficult one, and I think, Carl, you raised a very important question. If you have a single point of failure, or the possibility, and especially when it comes to quality, then you possibly have a inferno waiting to explode, because actually replacing or creating enough competition to actually force people to improve their quality standards generally is going to involve 2 or 3 operators. Very often when you have just a single operator, there's no incentive to improve quality. You just take what you get and you deal with it. And again, being the third operator on the northern route up to the Zimbabwean border, we're already seeing one of the existing 2 trying to see what it can do to actually up its service levels and start moving towards the 99 that we're expecting from them. You know, it's quite possible that the other will just fall by the wayside, or very soon we'll start doing the upgrade itself. If we've done that, then hopefully we've made some money for ourselves, but we've done the country a service at the same time. When you're looking at a single trench policy, everybody knows that unless you've built really cleverly with redundancy around rings, that single trench is going to be a point of failure, because it only then takes one contractor. And unfortunately, the majority of our breaks in South Africa and outside of South Africa tend to be road construction, road upgrades. It takes one contractor with a backhoe to put 4 or 5 fibers out of commission instead of just one fiber out of commission. That's the danger with the single trench. Those people who haven't built cleverly and who haven't designed and configured cleverly are then going to have a complete failure. those who've been able to and have had the resources to actually put in redundancy around that, well, then they'll have to move on to their failover. And hopefully their network is good enough. But yeah, single trench does have that risk. But you're not wasting money putting in multiple cables, some of which nobody knows where exactly they are, and you only find them when you're digging.